This video, we're going to talk about all the games that died in 2024, because for as many bangers that came out this year, like Palworld, Helldivers 2, Black Myth Wukong for example, well, we've also had a lot of games that just crashed and burned, with a couple of them being so bad that they actually both released and died in the same year. So let's go over all of these games and rank them all on a tier list, with S tier being, this game didn't deserve to die and I'm really sad that it did, all the way down to F tier, which means literally everybody saw this coming from a mile away. And I feel like we should start off by addressing the elephant in the room. You know, the reason you probably clicked on this video in the first place, which is Concord. Sony's golden goose that was supposed to be the next big hero shooter on the market, the Overwatch competitor with a Guardians of the Galaxy type aesthetic that just ended up failing so hard that it got its own museum exhibit at the Museum of Failure. Like, Concord's disaster was really no joke. This game started development right after Overwatch came out in 2016, so it was kind of like aiming to be an Overwatch knockoff, kind of just follow the hype train of hero shooters from back in the day, and if you were one of the 600 poor souls that actually paid $40 for a live service hero shooter in 2024, well, at least you could tell that the gameplay felt like it was from that era. You know, the game just felt dated. And that's because Concord was stuck in development hell for almost 8 years and it cost around $400 million to make. So for it to have existed in the hands of the players for a measly 2 weeks before it had to be shut down, you know, there has to be some sort of record, I think, because Concord released in August 23rd of 2024, and by September 6th, it was already shut down. Like, Sony didn't even want to bother trying the free-to-play route, they just figured the game was unsalvageable and just killed it on the spot. But all in all, Concord's gameplay was pretty bland, the character designs just didn't really look appealing whatsoever, like they just didn't look like heroes in a hero shooter. Like, I'm not saying that we needed sexy mamas on the roster for people to be excited to play the game, but I think that even Bastion for Overwatch had a better personality than the entire Concord roster, you know? And while a $40 price tag on today's market for a live service game, that was almost like an immediate sign that this was just gotta fail. This is not going to go anywhere. So I think if we have to rank Concord on the tier list, I think it gets a pretty well-deserved F tier on the list. Now, for a game that failed surprisingly a lot faster than what Concord did this year, and you know, not many people remember it because it's just, at this point, it's just gone down the memory hole. But allow me to remind you of one of the biggest flops in recent gaming history with The Day Before. Now, The Day Before, if you've heard about this game, you probably just got a bunch of war flashbacks, but this was a highly anticipated game that was supposed to be an open world zombie survival MMO type of game that somehow managed to get into the top wish-listed game on Steam at the time, mainly because of all the hype behind the trailers that the dev studio Fantastic was coming out with, because they were making The Day Before seem like a mixture between The Last of Us and The Division, but with all the delays and all the controversies that the game got involved with, and the fact that the developers were just refusing to show any sort of gameplay for The Day Before, well, a lot of people were calling the game a scam. And well, what do you know? When it actually did release in December of 2023, it actually was a scam. Because The Day Before was a classic bait and switch where instead of getting an open world zombie survival MMO, what you actually got was like a surface level bland experience that was actually an extraction shooter instead, with none of the features that were promised in the trailers. And the gameplay itself looked more like a closed alpha test than an actual finished game. So just 4 days after The Day Before came out, the developers came out with a statement saying that, hey, we're pulling The Day Before from the stores, you're not going to be able to buy it anymore, and it's also a commercial failure. Just 4 days after the game came out, and while the servers officially shut down on January of 2024, so in terms of what we're going to put The Day Before on the tier list, I think this one deserves a really nice cozy spot next to Concord on the F tier. But I think that we need to take a break from dumping games over to the F tier, so let's bring up one of the games that it could have been a household name in the Battle Royale genre. It was like almost there, if it wasn't a victim of such horrible mismanagement from the developers over at Hi-Rez. So of course we got to talk about Royale, which came out all the way back in 2018 during the height of the Battle Royale craze. This was one of the biggest BR games at the time. Granted, there weren't that many BR games back in the day other than just like Fortnite and PUBG, and maybe a few others here and there, but getting over 100,000 concurrent players isn't something that just happens accidentally, you know? There has to be some sort of spark, some magic there, and Realm Royale had that magic. So the fact that now we're talking about how the game is shutting down is pretty surprising, but last October, Hi-Rez announced that they just really can't support the game anymore. Realm Royale is going to shut down in February, but man, you know, this is the typical Hi-Rez experience. Because if you've played any other Hi-Rez game before, like Realm Royale, Paladins, Rogue Company, you know, all that stuff, they're genuinely fun when they do come out. You know, they have a lot of potential, but Hi-Rez always manages to somehow just take that viral ability to bring the players in and just mess it up somehow. Like whether it's with terrible updates or bad business decisions that end up driving the player base away, something always happens. And then the player base is just left feeling abandoned, thinking like, wow, this could have been something awesome, but Hi-Res just managed to screw it up. Oh, and since we're on the topic of Hi-Res killing games, I suppose we can also talk about their other game that they announced that they're shutting down too, called Divine Knockout, which is honestly my favorite game from them because I'm someone who grew up playing a lot of Smash Bros. And platform fighters, so seeing Hi-Res come out with a 3D platform fighter where you played as different gods from different religions, honestly, that was pretty awesome, you know, I gotta admit. But man, did they manage to mess up Divine Knockout, because it was an always online, grindy, microtransaction-riddled mess where you were basically forced to spend money if you wanted to play as all the gods. You know, you couldn't unlock them all through progression. You were limited to like only a certain amount of coins. You know, everything about the game was just incentivizing you to spend money, basically. And that was on top of an initial $20 price tag that the game came out with too. So what Hi-Res did is that they initially hyped up the game to have a solid competitive fan base with tournaments and everything, but then they just decided to go radio silent and just completely abandon Divine Knockout just like 4 months after the game launched. And obviously, if you just stop updating a live service game, what happens? People, you know, they get bored. They just want to leave. They have no incentive to keep playing the game. And maybe Divine Knockout didn't hit 100,000 concurrent players like how Realm Royale did. And yes, the game was a microtransaction-riddled mess that was handled terribly by Hi-Res, but yeah, I gotta admit that the gameplay for Divine Knockout was actually super fun and addicting, so this one I'm especially sad to see it go. But, you know, in terms of Realm Royale, I'm gonna put Realm Royale on the S tier because there's just no way it deserved to be treated the way that it did. Realm Royale definitely had a lot more potential. Divine Knockout, though, I totally understand why it was destined to fail from the start, so I'm gonna put that one on a C tier. But now it's time to rank another game that released in 2024 all the way back in May that's already been scheduled to be shut down because, well, I suppose it just really couldn't live up to its reputation of being the next Call of Duty killer. So what we're talking about here is XDefiant, the game that broke 1 million unique players just 2 hours after the servers went online, and it was a free-to-play, fast-paced sumo shooter that, you know, on paper, it sounded like a cool concept for a game because you had different classes that hailed from the different Ubisoft titles, like Splinter Cell, The Division, and they even added like an Assassin's Creed class as well. But whenever a game gets called the something killer, that's never really a good sign, and what happened with XDefiant is that the game was pretty busted when it came out. Like, it was riddled with bugs and a lot of server issues, and a lot of the players were complaining that the gunplay itself wasn't really in a good state because there was a lot of hit reg issues and just like abilities straight up just not working when you press the button. So Ubisoft probably should have left this one cooking a little bit longer before they released it to the public, but they just decided to just release it in the state that it was, you know? And the idea that the game had an unranked mode that didn't use skill-based matchmaking was interesting enough to get people, you know, into the door, but when they actually sat down to play XDefiant, they were just not having a good time. So after 7 months of trying to get people interested in playing the game again, Ubisoft just decided to call it quits and announce that the servers were going to shut down. So in terms of where we're going to put XDefiant on the tier list, I think this one is a solid B tier, because unfortunately the Call of Duty killer ended up feeling more like a Call of Duty knockoff instead. So next up on the chopping block, we have to talk about Blue Protocol, which is a Bandai Namco game that a lot of people surprisingly haven't heard before, because it was supposed to come out in the West. The game released in Japan back in June of 2023, and it was going to be a brand new open world MMO gacha style kind of game, kind of like how Genshin Impact is. And you guys know how much money that style of game makes, right? Like, the amount of revenue that gacha games make is just ridiculous because they're so addictive. But Blue Protocol in particular, that one was handled so poorly that not only did they cancel the Western release of the game, but they also announced that they're shutting down in Japan too. Like, the main problem that Blue Protocol had was that the developers were mostly just inexperienced when it came to making a gacha game. You know, they just didn't know how to perfect that milking formula that you see in other more successful games in the genre, and apparently what really turned the players off from Blue Protocol was the fact that the end game was just way too grindy, and the progression system just felt unreasonably difficult. Like, a lot of people like to blame the lack of immediate global release for Blue Protocol's failure, but the fact that it failed in the places where it did release kind of just tells a different story. So in terms of where we're going to put Blue Protocol on the tier list, I think we're going to put this one on the C tier. Now, this next one was an online-only racing game that was also made by Ubisoft. Ubisoft has not been having a good time recently, and well, this one released all the way back in 2014. It's been out for a while, and to be honest, it wasn't really really that good of a game to begin with. It wasn't really that popular based off the mixed reviews, but it did lead the way for a campaign against killing games to be created. So the game that we're talking about is called The Crew, which was an okay racing game at best, but the always online aspect of it gave it a lot of technical issues and glitches. Plus, this was, 2014. This was the early days of microtransactions before they became the norm, so the game got a lot of hate because of that too. But the small fan base that the game actually managed to get was loyal enough that when the game's servers did shut down in 2024, like I mentioned, it did lead to a campaign called Stop Killing Games to be formed because there was no way to play The Crew anymore, even if you owned the physical copy of the game. And apparently things escalated with the game's shutdown that two people even tried to sue Ubisoft for tricking them into buying a game that they thought they had actual ownership of. And well, the absolute wave of backlash that was caused by The Crew shutting down was big enough actually that Ubisoft even came out with a statement saying that they're at least working for an offline mode with the game's two sequels, The Crew 2 and The Crew Motorfest. So it looks like The Crew's death wasn't really entirely in vain. At least we did get something good out of it, at least. But in terms of where we're gonna put The Crew on the tier list, I think this game deserves a solid B tier because it's not like the game really had any reason to die in the first place. You could have just shut the servers down and just let people play against NPCs, but no, Ubisoft decided to just not only shut it down, but make it literally unplayable for anybody. And then next on our list is Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance. And now, I've always been a diehard fan of these medieval style kind of games with the warriors and the magics and all that sort of stuff. And if I were to go based off the trailers alone, I would say that, hey, this is the type of game I would play and have fun with, if I knew about it. I learned about it recently. But it looks like things didn't really go according to plan for Dark Alliance because based off the reviews I'm seeing here, a lot of people are saying that the game had a lot of potential, but the way that the game was handled by the developers and the speed in which they were squashing the bugs that kept popping up was bad enough that people felt like the game was just a quick cash grab and the development was abandoned. So Dark Alliance recently announced that the game is going to shut down in February, but the curious thing about this situation is that anybody who still owns the game is still able to play it in single player, which is a great thing for game preservation, but once the servers shut down for good, they're also going to pull Dark Alliance from the store and make it impossible to buy, which really doesn't make any sense to me because if you can play the game completely in single player, then why remove it from the stores entirely? Like in this case, I've never really played the game before, so I can't give you my honest opinion on how dependent the game is on online multiplayer, but if there's enough meat in it for you to be able to enjoy the single player aspect of it, then at least give the players the option to play the game offline, especially since the game came out in 2021, so it's still like a relatively fresh title. But this whole pulling the game from the stores and not letting you play even the single player part of it anymore, kind of weird, I don't really understand it. So if we're gonna put Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance anywhere on this tier list, I think we're gonna have to put it at C tier because it doesn't make sense. But yeah guys, that's the entire tier list. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a comment down below. I know there's a lot of mobile games that are scheduled to be shut down this year and the next, but the list was just unimaginably big because there's just way too many mobile games that are dying recently. Let me know if you want me to talk about that too. But yeah, anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.